This presentation provides you with a background to key international climate change agreements and national climate change policies important to consider when developing climate change responses for your area. The presentation covers international climate change agreements such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, national policies and plans such as South Africa's nationally determined contributions, the National Climate Change Response White Paper, and the National Development Plan. It also covers local climate change research documents, such as the long-term mitigation scenarios and the long-term adaptation scenarios. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is an international treaty that was initiated during the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. The UNFCCC provides guidance on setting protocols and agreements on greenhouse gas reductions. Since 1995, a total of 197 parties to the convention have met annually at the Conference of the Parties to assess global progress in combating climate change, as well as to agree to protocols in response to climate change. The Paris Agreement is the most recent of these agreements. The Paris Agreement was unanimously accepted at the 21st Conference of the Parties, or COP21, in 2015, and it came into effect on the 4th of November 2016. This agreement is quite significant as it is the first international agreement on climate change response that all countries have committed to. Through the agreement, countries have agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions so that in the long term, the global temperature increase is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Countries who have committed to the Paris Agreement also commit to reporting on both their carbon emissions and their adaptation responses. To keep track of these efforts, countries are required to develop their nationally determined contributions, which map out their plans to reduce their emissions in line with the international goal, and develop adaptation plans that include their adaptation priorities and implementation interventions. Countries that have committed to the Paris Agreement are required to submit this information every 5 years. In the lead-up to COP21, countries needed to develop intended nationally determined contributions. These are the contributions that each country would make towards addressing climate change. Once the Paris Agreement was signed, the intended nationally determined contributions came into effect and were rephrased as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. With regards to mitigation, South Africa's nationally determined contributions commits to emissions in a range between 398 and 614 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by years 2025 and 2030. South Africa has committed to a peak, plateau and decline greenhouse gas emissions trajectory range. This will involve greenhouse gas emissions peaking between year 2020 and 2025, stabilizing or plateauing for the 10 years after this period, and declining thereafter. South Africa intends to achieve this through the following key policy instruments: a carbon tax, desired emissions reduction outcomes for sectors, company carbon budgets, and regulatory standards and controls for specifically identified greenhouse gas pollutants and emitters. With regards to adaptation, the South Africa's nationally determined contributions commit to the following 6 key activities for the year 2020 to 2030 period: to develop a national adaptation plan, to take into account climate considerations in the development of national, subnational, and sector policy frameworks, to build the necessary institutional capacity for climate change response planning and implementation, to develop an early warning, vulnerability, and adaptation monitoring system for key climate vulnerable sectors and geographic areas, to develop a vulnerability assessment and adaptation needs framework, as well as communication of past investments in adaptation for education and awareness, as well as for international recognition. The National Climate Change Response White Paper was published in 2011 by the National Department of Environmental Affairs The White Paper outlines the South African vision and policy for the development of an effective national response to climate change by working towards building a climate-resilient and a lower-carbon economy and society. The White Paper requires the development of sector-based climate change adaptation plans by national departments, and the overall approach is one of climate change resilience development through both mitigation and adaptation responses. The National Development Plan 2030 is a long-term plan that focuses on eliminating poverty and reducing inequality by the year 2030. One of the focus areas of the plan is around creating an environmentally sustainable country that has transitioned in an equitable way to a low-carbon economy. Building sustainable communities, responding effectively to climate change, and managing a just transition to a lower-carbon economy are highlighted in the plan. 12 key outcomes have been developed in order to monitor the plan's progress. Outcome number 10 focuses on environmental assets and natural resources. This outcome identifies climate change mitigation and adaptation measures aimed at building a sustainable environment, which includes the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants, as well as the development of sector adaptation plans for key sectors such as agriculture, water, and human settlements. The outcome also highlights the need to integrate environmental issues into land use plans, as well as national, provincial, and municipal development plans. Outcome number 8 focuses on the provision of sustainable human settlements and improved quality of life through the provision of accommodation and services for people living in informal settlements and low-income housing. The long-term mitigation scenarios process was completed in 2007 with the aim of outlining different scenarios of mitigation action for South Africa. The key findings from the long-term mitigation scenarios was that if South Africa continues to grow without constraints, emissions will increase fourfold by the year 2050. The long-term mitigation scenarios lists a wide range of detailed mitigation actions and proposals and the costs of these various interventions to the economy. No or low-cost interventions include commercial, residential, and industrial energy efficiency, renewables, agriculture manure management, land use such as fire control and savanna thickening, passenger modal shifts, improved vehicle efficiency, and a solar water heater subsidy. The long-term adaptation scenarios flagship research program was implemented by the Department of Environmental Affairs in order to outline the potential risks and vulnerabilities of climate change in different sectors in South Africa. These were developed as climate change reports for all major sectors in the country, such as human settlements, agriculture, biodiversity, and so forth. The long-term adaptation scenarios reports provide a summary of the potential impacts from climate change in these sectors and also outlines potential response options. The long-term adaptation scenario reports were developed over 2 phases. The first phase, which was completed in June 2013, included climate change trends and projections for South Africa, summarized key climate change impacts, and identified potential response options for key sectors. The second phase was completed in July 2014 and focused on cross-cutting and integration issues including climate information and early warning systems, disaster risk reduction, human settlements, and food security. This presentation has provided you with a background to key international climate change agreements and national climate change policies. It is important that these are considered when sector-related, provincial, and local climate change responses and strategies are developed. In the upcoming presentation, we will specifically look at the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform's Rural Human Settlements Climate Change Adaptation Strategy that's been developed in line with these key climate change policies.